On this episode of the Catholic Echo podcast from the Diocese of Youngstown, brought to you by the annual Diocesan Appeal and Cumulus Radio Youngstown, we're talking about the URSULINE Sisters Anniversary with Bishop David Bonnar, URSULINE Sister Mary McCormick, and Tom Welsh. Find more about this episode's topic, including articles from the Catholic Echo, at www.catholicecho.org/podcast. And now the host of the Catholic Echo podcast, Dennis Viviana.
Hello and welcome to the Catholic Echo podcast. As always, we are joined by Bishop David Bonnar. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Dennis.
Well, this week we're talking about the 150-year anniversary of the URSULINE Sisters of Youngstown. They began in the city in 1874, and although their population is aging, they remain a beacon for hope and change. Bishop Bonnar, do you have a favorite story over the years working with the URSULINE Sisters?
Well, I've only been here a little over 3 years, so I don't have a favorite story. I mean, there aren't that many stories. There's only been a handful of interfacing with the community. I will say that I was so honored to be part of the opening of their 150th anniversary celebration by celebrating the Mass and delivering the homily. That is something that's engraved in my mind and heart. And, I also received from Sister Mary McCormick, I was one of the first ones to receive it, the beautiful book documenting their outreach in this Diocese of Youngstown and really what a difference that they have made. I also remember as a new bishop being invited to go there to their mother house and to celebrate Mass with them and have a meal.
150 years is remarkable. What do you think has led to their longevity, number one, and why do you think it's important that they document that 150 years in a new book?
I think the answer to your question comes down to one word: grace. They're women of grace who embrace a charism and been very intentional and faithful in living out that charism, even to this day with their various outreaches. They were instrumental in Ursuline High School at one time. They still serve on the board as well. So I think that they're embracing of grace, of God's grace. And it's always important to share your story, because if we don't tell our story, we become irrelevant. So I commend the dear sisters on all of their celebratory endeavors in this year of anniversary to tell their story, because it is a very compelling story.
Now, their immigration outreach program serves dozens of families, over 100 adults and children, and that need continues to grow.
Just given where we are here in Youngstown, there's always great social needs, and I'm just grateful that the sisters are here with their many outreaches, because they do make a difference. They did for some time have a preschool, but they had to close that more recently. But they continue to make their mark here in this portion of the Lord's vineyard.
Yes, fighting for social justice as well. Sisters, let's be honest here, they have a median age of 80 years old. I guess what's being done by the sisters for outreach to continue this organization is they look to thrive over the next 150 years.
Well, I think what's happened here is that, like so many religious communities, their identity goes beyond themselves. It's not just their foundress, but it's the people that they accompany and who get excited about their mission. And we see that with their many outreaches. So I'm confident that these outreaches will continue for many years to come, albeit through lay people.
It is exciting, putting together the feature. You go through so many pictures and things. It's great to see younger people being involved. That could be a link to broadening their religious life as well.
And I just appreciate what they do for the good of this church. It's not just the social outreach, but we have Sister Mary Alice, who is the pastoral associate at St. Luke's and St. Charles, working with Monsignor Zora and Father Brian Klein. We have Sister Mary McCormick, who is their leader, but she is the academic dean at the seminary in Cleveland, where we send our men, just a learned woman. And the Ursulines are involved with Beatitude House. They're small, but they're strong.
One thing I did notice when I was on site there doing the story, there is construction underway currently to turn a portion of their mother house, which is on Shields Road in Canfield, into an assisted living facility for retired sisters and lay residents. Why do you think a project like that was needed here in the Mahoning Valley?
Well, I think that, life is a progression for all of us, whether we're ordained or vowed to consecrate a life or married or single. And there does come a time when our faculties diminish, limitations ensue, physical limitations ensue, and we need more assistance in terms of our living and our lifestyle. And so, I think this is very prudent of the sisters to plan ahead, and they're probably just being mindful of not only their progression, because they always think more of others than they do of themselves, but I think it's just mindful of that natural progression of life, and to try to continue to lead that full and vibrant life.
Thank you very much, Bishop Bonnar. Make sure to keep it here. In the next segment, you'll hear from Sister Mary McCormick. She is the 21st General Superior of the Ursuline Sisters, also a professor at St. Mary's Seminary in Wycliffe. Much more on the Catholic Echo podcast when we return.
When storms hit, we are there to rebuild. As our neighbors age, we lighten their burdens. As our veterans adjust, we ease their transitions. We are Catholic Charities, and we are there. Join us at wearethere.us.
When the Ursulines first came to Youngstown, it was the beginning of a new chapter of a story, an old story, but a new chapter in that story.
Sister Mary McCormick, a Ursuline graduate, and Sister Norma Roppel, a Cardinal Mooney graduate, have known one another for 50 years. On this day, they reflect upon their decades of experience as Ursuline sisters in Youngstown. Many of the order's traditions and values date back to foundress St. Angela Merici.
St. Angela was a woman who was committed to the gospel, committed to the Catholic Church. She recognized, as I think everybody did in the church, including church leaders, that the church needed some reform, but decided she wanted to stay in it. She also wanted to find a new way for women to be connected to the church.
Sister Mary is the 21st General Superior of the Ursuline Sisters of Youngstown. She's also a professor of systematic theology and the academic dean for St. Mary's Seminary in Wycliffe. She says in 1874, 6 Catholic nuns arrived from Cleveland to teach at what once was St. Columba's School. The original convent was located on Rayen Avenue. When Sister Mary joined in 1975, 12 years after the current Mother House was built on Shields Road in Canfield, the Catholic Church was in the midst of a sea change that brought nearly 200 sisters to religious life.
In the 1950s and until the middle of the 1960s, literally convents and seminaries were just bursting at the seams. And that was true all over North America, that there was just a great zeal after World War II to serve the church, to be of service.
Over the decades, their mission expanded to not only beacons of Christian values, but caring for the poor and fighting for social justice.
We were a group of about 17 who joined in '64.
Sister Norma Roppel is part of the leadership team of the Ursuline Sisters in the Diocese of Youngstown and is the Director of English as a second language program and outreach to the Hispanic community. And although there are only 26 sisters remaining with a median age of 80 years old, Sister Norma says their work with the Beatitude House, with young adults, their Mission Immigrant Outreach Program, and Permanent Supportive Housing Program continues to fuel their passion.
Church is evolving so differently right now, and we just want to be present and welcoming to young adults. It's a very meaningful and fulfilling way of life, and to reach out in love and service that's different than family life.
Both sisters say it's been a joy to collect stories for the Ursuline Sisters of Youngstown book by Thomas Welsh. And although the Ursuline Sisters have adapted to changes and embraced the power of social media, one constant that remains is a sense of continuity.
A couple of our sisters who live here have been in religious life for 70 years, so nearly half of the entire history. It's exciting to kind of look back at that and have people tell the story and reflect on it. Where is the continuity? Where is that sense of, I am still doing today exactly what I thought I would be doing when I entered religious life, whether it was 50 years ago or 60 years ago or 70 years ago, but in many other ways my life is so different.
I also spoke with Sister Mary McCormick more in depth about the book written by local author Thomas Welsh. She also spoke a bit about the history of St. Angela Merici in Youngstown.
Here's my favorite part. It's not a particular story, but I think one of the gifts that Tom Welsh brought to it was also a sense of knowing history and knowing not only history in general, but what was going on in the United States, what was going on in the church, what was going on in Youngstown. And his aunt, Sister Marcia Welsh, was a member of our community. So he had another insight, another way of looking at us too, kind of from a family perspective. This was his father's sister who was a member of religious life. So he approached the project now with kind of a scholar sense of, here's the bigger cultural situation, here's what I knew, and how do I bring in these other stories? And I think he was very insightful in putting those stories together. What was going on in the larger U.S. Youngstown church world with these particular stories. And that's how everybody lives out their life. Everybody lives one day at a time, 1 week at a time, 1 year at a time. But we live our lives in this larger cultural situation. What somebody like Tom does is help us to give a particular focus to it. He also is a visual artist, and he's done some sculpture kinds of things, and that I'm not an artist at all, but the way he kind of chisels out the particular features of any one event in light of this larger thing. I think he's really skilled at that, and that was a great deal of fun. Michelle and I got a chance to read the book as it was being produced, and it was a lot of fun to kind of see how he put it together. And then we had some opportunities to do a little bit of editing. The parish now that is St. Angela Merici is the merger of Immaculate Conception and Sacred Heart. And both of those parishes were parishes that when they opened, our sisters went there. St. Columba was the first, but quickly after, those parishes opened, along with St. Cyril's and St. Peter and Paul. So as the church kind of spread out a little bit from Elm Street, Rayen Avenue, Wood Street, it went both east and west a little bit and served the people. And so our sisters were intimately involved with the people both at Immaculate Conception and at Sacred Heart. In fact, that's how I think they got the name St. Angela Merici, when they were as part of the merger process. And their merger goes back a number of years. We're doing a lot of them now, but theirs goes back a number of years now. And they were saying, all right, we are going to have a merger of these two parishes of the past, Immaculate Conception and Sacred Heart, both on the east side of Youngstown. What is it that links our history? And one of the things was remembering the nuns in the school. And so there was a proposal that perhaps we ought to name the parish after St. Angela Merici, who founded the Ursuline Sisters, because the sisters were so closely aligned to all of the people at the Immaculate and all of the people at Sacred Heart. And so, well, I think there is a statue of St. Angela in the back of the parish now. All of the old stained glass windows are really from the founding of the parish, so there's a big Sacred Heart, there's a big crucifix, but what the people remembered was the influence of the sisters, and that's why it's named Angela Merici.
Very good. Sister Mary McCormick, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Coming up next, Call and Vote sits down with author Tom Welsh. Keep it here, much more to come in the Catholic Echo podcast.
Wondering what happened to timely Catholic news in the Diocese of Youngstown? It's at catholicecho.org. Sign up for the email newsletter while you're there to have Catholic news delivered to your inbox.
The Catholic Echo magazine is delivered free of charge to anyone who is registered at a parish in the Diocese of Youngstown. But subscriptions are also available for non-parishioners. A subscription costs $40 per year, and you can buy one for yourself or gift a subscription to a loved one. Email Catholic Echo at youngstowndiocese.org for more information.
Welcome back to the Catholic Echo podcast. I'm your host, Colin Vogt, and I'm here with Tom Welsh, a local historian and the author of 5 books on local Youngstown history, including his new book, The Ursuline Sisters of Youngstown, Serving the Mahoning Valley Since 1874. Tom, how are you doing?
Very good, and thanks for the invitation. I appreciate it, Colin. Good talking to you.
So can you tell us a little bit about your new book, The Ursuline Sisters of Youngstown?
Yes, this book was conceived as not the centerpiece, but certainly as part of the Ursuline Sisters' year-long celebration of their 150th anniversary. Really have to thank Michelle Ristich-Gatz, who was then serving as communications director for the Ursuline Sisters, and who really conceived of this project. She knew that I was involved in other local history projects, and I had envisioned a project that didn't happen, but which involved a few members of the Ursuline community. And so that turned out to be kind of serendipitous, because Michelle immediately said, well, why don't we do a book on the Ursulines? I myself have a long-standing connection to the Ursulines. I had 3 close relatives who were part of the community, one who still is. Sister Marcia Welsh was my aunt. Sister Martina Casey was a second cousin, as is Sister Norma Roppel. I was a distant cousin, I believe, to Sister Ellen Rose Donovan, so I was there a lot. There's not a time I can remember where I wasn't aware of the Ursulines. As it turned out, I'd also written a dissertation on the history of local Catholic education and some of the factors that led to its decline, and that involved a number of interviews with the Ursulines. And so it seemed like a good fit to everyone involved.
So can you give us an overview of the 150 years of Ursuline sister history here in the Mahoning Valley?
Well, I think what makes the Ursuline Sisters unique, we've had a lot of orders who have been active in the Youngstown area, in the Mahoning Valley, in a variety of capacities, in education, in healthcare, you name it. But I think that what makes the Ursulines unique is that they were the one order that was based here. Their mother house was actually here in the Mahoning Valley. Their impact on education was profound. Also, they have managed to reinvent themselves over and over again in ways that have enabled them to address some of the more urgent issues of the time. And I think one of the things the Ursulines would agree with is that capacity for reinvention goes back to the origins of the community. St. Angela Merici said one of her urgent recommendations was meet the needs of the time. And obviously, for a long time, education was one of those needs that the Ursulines felt compelled to address. I think over time, we found the Ursulines addressing social issues that are far removed from formal education, such as Beatitude House, working with single mothers and their children, helping those families to find their way back into the economy, the HIV/AIDS ministry, the work with immigrants that they've done. The Ursulines, I think, are operating very much in the spirit of their founder, who, by the way, was not a formal educator. St. Angela Merici was often depicted teaching a young girl. That's true in the most general sense, because she certainly was involved in helping young women get onto a good path. So what's interesting about the story of the Ursulines is you find them in some ways going full circle. It's a bittersweet story for those who remember when the Ursuline Mother House housed 110 sisters and novices. We're obviously not there today. We have an aging and shrinking community. But on the other hand, if you look at the Ursulines at the time of their inception, they were not a formal religious, a formal monastic community, if you will, at that time. They were a community of lay people, of women who did not live together in a large mother house or convent, who lived independently and worked together with other lay people to address some of the issues of the time and to shore up a church that at that time was divided and compromised. So what might look like a story that is one of decline and entropy is actually, in some ways, a story of a community returning to its origins in many cases.
So from Italy to Cleveland to Youngstown.
Right.
How did that transition from Cleveland to Youngstown go?
That turned out to be one of the chapters that wrote itself. We were talking a little bit earlier about the writing process. How do you present a topic in a way that's compelling? I felt that just the image of 6 sisters, a small cohort of nuns coming from Cleveland to this gritty industrial town, where you could see the air at that point, and it was black. And it was black. Definitely an industrial town. There's no question about it. And it was also a town that was ethnically divided. No less than Cleveland, I'm sure. But being a smaller community, there was a lot more intimacy. And so they walked into a situation where not only did you have a Catholic community that was just developing, but you also had a Catholic community that was deeply divided. And when I say along ethnic lines, we tend to think of the later conflicts that develop between Northern Europeans and Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans. But This was strictly between Northern Europeans, and primarily between the Germans and the Irish, who had diametrically opposed visions of the church.
So how did the Ursuline sisters find their way in this emerging economic town, and with this racial divide that was going on? How did they get established here?
Well, it's interesting. They almost ended very shortly after their arrival here because apparently the Ursuline community was a microcosm of that. They were divided along ethnic lines. Many of them had brothers who were members of the clergy who were deeply divided in this conflict, this ethnic and religious conflict. In any case, Bishop Gilmore of Cleveland was a Scots Presbyterian by birth.
Okay.
So he had no interest in this ethnic conflict and very impatient with it. And when he realized that it was a problem with the Ursulines in Youngstown, he visited them personally and more or less said, we're terminating this community. And it was Sister Felix Paulian who was basically had the presence of mind to say, may I accompany you to the gate, Your Excellency? He said, fine. And he said, I'm going to request that you change your mind. This was a kind of presumptuous thing to say to a bishop. And he said, I'm not accustomed to changing my mind, sister. And, Your Excellency, even God changed his mind at one point. He said, well, when was that? And she told the story of Nineveh, where God was planning to destroy the city and changed his mind. And she said, okay, what's your plan? And so she said, I would recommend that since this conflict has been encouraged by the Ursuline community in Cleveland, and our mother superiors have always been from Cleveland, why don't we have someone come from the Toledo community where this particular ethnic rivalry doesn't exist? And at that point, he agreed. And at that point, Sister Mother McCaffrey from Toledo became really, in a way, the second founder of the Ursuline community in Youngstown. She led them through a period of exponential growth.
Looking back now, what might you say are some of the biggest contributions that the Ursuline sisters have made to Mahoning Valley, or, Diocese of Youngstown, or just the world?
I think certainly when you think of the Ursulines, even to this day, many people talk about education, not only in Catholic education. I think they really kind of upped the standards. I mean, when you think about it, in the early 1960s, 1/3 of the students in the Youngstown area were going to Catholic schools.
Yeah.
So the project of Catholic education had a big impact on education in general. And I think there was a level of cooperation, too, after a certain point, particularly after the war, where Catholic educators and Ursuline sisters and others in particular really were very attentive to the trends in public education, and there was influence back and forth. I'd say their impact on education was profound. It's really almost impossible to determine the full impact of their influence in Youngstown because they touched so many lives. In fact, the foreword was written by actor Ed O'Neill, and one of the reasons he felt compelled to write a foreword was because Sister Rosemary Dybel at Ursuline was the one who saw in this young jock, basically, someone who was a football star at that point, who was actually focused on a professional sports career. And she got him involved in, it wasn't debate, it was called dramatic interpretation. Students would do dramatic readings from some written text. And then, as he put it, drafted him into the Christmas show. He said he shouldn't really ask.
That sounds like a very sister-like thing to do.
Right. You're going to be good at this.
Voluntold,
you're doing
I think
it,
they call
right?
it. Yeah.
That's it, right? In any case, he not only made a big impression at the school, but apparently the WKBN broadcast a live version of the play, so he got a lot of positive attention for that. And later, when his sports career went sideways, it was something he eventually thought about. But that's one of so many examples, of people who were personally touched by the Ursulines. And then, as the situation with Catholic education changed, and obviously some of that had to do with the decline in vocations, it became a very expensive project to maintain because you had to pay lay teachers a livable wage. And you had a situation in which Catholics were accustomed to paying very little for religious education. And we owe a lot to the Ursuline Sisters, the Humility of Mary, and every other religious order for that because they were working for a stipend, and in some cases less than that. And that kind of underscores their contribution. So the Ursulines found ways to make themselves useful by serving as directors of religious education, by moving into all kinds of positions within the diocese. I believe the founding director of the audiovisual library at the Diocese of Youngstown was an Ursuline sister, and so so many people visible even in areas that are outside the purview of traditional parish schools. Sister Jerome Corcoran, for instance, who was setting up essentially charter schools, And then we've already touched on programs like Beatitude House, Ursulines who were involved in all kinds of social issues that have become relevant to Catholics, but were not necessarily part of the bailiwick of the Ursulines in the past. So their capacity to reinvent themselves when the schools were no longer this vast pattern of Catholic education that you had in the past, the Ursulines nevertheless found a way to make themselves relevant, even in the face of declining vocations. I mean, and again, that's counterintuitive. If you see an organization as losing numbers, we tend to think of that organization as also losing vitality. And yet, the Ursulines were incredibly visible.
Well, that kind of leads me to the next question. So what's the situation like with the Ursuline Sisters now?
First of all, they've been very much ahead of the curve in terms of planning. And again, it's important to remember that these are nationwide trends. This is not specific to this community. As other religious communities dealt with the realities of declining vocations, they often found themselves tearing down mother houses, okay?
Yeah.
And we can see that the Ursulines were continually planning. They have turned that beautiful mother house in Canfield into a community resource. And we have apartments for moderate income seniors. There's a beautiful auditorium there. They are now in the process of creating assisted living component because obviously some of the sisters are getting older, but they're also again opening that up to the larger community. I think what's remarkable about the Ursulines is the kind of cool-headed planning they did as they faced these kinds of challenges that many other religious communities have faced throughout the country.
What was it like to write this book?
First of all, it was a real privilege, having known the Ursulines for as far back as I can remember. This was not a job that I treated frivolously. And I also realized that I was dealing with a word limit. And that was one of the big challenges, in fact. I think toward the end of the project, I must have cut about 25,000 words. And yet, I have to say, what resulted from that process was a much cleaner narrative.
Let me just ask this. How much research went into this book?
There was an awful lot of research. The Ursulines played a pivotal role in that, and Michelle Gatz helped to facilitate the interviews. I did have one advantage insofar as I had written a dissertation about the Catholic schools in Youngstown, had done interviews with people like the late Sister Teresa Winson and Sister Julia Belush and Sister Virginia McDermott and so many others who are no longer with us. So fortunately, because of that previous research, there were voices from the past that might not have been represented otherwise. But the Ursuline archives played a significant role in the project. They were voluminous. There had also been, thankfully, a number of efforts in the past on the part of the sisters themselves to document their history, and those narrative histories were critical. I was so happy that those were in place. But knitting it all together was another chapter altogether, and I think what I found was the best way to start a chapter was with something tangible that would help the reader understand why this era was significant. Mm-hmm. One of the most nicest compliments I received, and I believe it was Sister Marlene Legrasso, who said, "This is almost like you painted a mural of our history."
Oh, really?
And I said, well, and having some with an art background, that was doubly flattering, I thought. That was the effort, is to help the reader to experience some of these scenes from the past.
Well, you certainly have painted quite a picture. Such an amazing thing to get to experience this pivotal part of Youngstown's history. So we thank you, and if people would like to pick up your book, where should they go for that?
The book is available at the Mahoning Valley Historical Society. It's available at Barnes & Noble, Leanna's Books in Austintown, and it's also available online. For further information, feel free to contact Ursuline Sisters.
Thank you so much for joining us today,
Colin.
Tom. It's been a great pleasure.
It's been a great pleasure for me, too. I appreciate it.
If you'd like more information on this or any of the other anniversary celebrations that are going on this year, go to catholicecho.org.
The Catholic Echo podcast is a production of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Youngstown. Your host has been Dennis Viviano. Have a blessed day, and may God be with you.